speaking with a Terroir workshop presenter, Emily Grosvenor, and she is a McMinnville resident and has been offering several different workshops over the course of time. This is your third year with Terroir, I believe.
Yes, it is.
And can you tell us a little bit about the writing life here in McMinnville and how you came to be at Terroir, which I believe you had more than one workshop over the last 3 years. Tell us about your involvement with Terroir and some of the workshops.
So I've been in McMinnville for about 5 years. For the first couple years I was having my babies, and then I was slowly kind of watching what was out there and kind of getting a sense for the literary community. And then the festival kind of came out of nowhere, and I knew I had something to contribute. So that first year that I was involved, I just sent them an idea for a travel writing workshop, and they snatched me up pretty quick, and I gave my first talk. Afterwards, I really wanted to get involved with it. It's really fun to be a part of the shaping of a festival. It's great to feel like you have a stake in your literary community. So I joined the board, and in the years since I've been able to help steer with a group of wonderful board members. We decided who gets to come to the festival, how to tell the stories about the festival, how to try to entice people to come, and how to really make it an inspirational event for all of the writers in this county. We live in a pretty rural area, and writers are not always known for being the most social beings, so it's really been a fun challenge to try to get people out of the woodwork, get them involved, get them away from their desks, and get them excited about kind of that magic that can happen when you get writers in the same space.
So Emily, tell us about some of these workshops you've led at Terroir over the years.
So the first one I gave was the travel writing workshop. I firmly believe that all writers should be doing travel writing. In fact, I don't really believe that anyone should be a professional travel writer doing it full time, because you need to do it really well. You need to bring really fresh eyes every time you go to a place. But it's the kind of writing that every writer, whether if they're a fiction writer, a magazine writer, a journalist, a poet, every genre writer can do travel writing and bring something to it. So the talk that I gave that first year was just an introduction to how one might go about getting work as a travel writer, like adding travel writing to your portfolio as something that you do. And the year afterwards, all of these workshops that I'm doing emerged because I am a working writer. I am constantly learning, I'm constantly acquiring information about how to do things, and it feels really extraordinary to give back, to share that information. We live in an age when the information wants to be free, and the magic happens when you share the information. So, I'll learn how to do something, and then what I want to do then is talk about it with other writers. So that second year, I was in the process of creating my first nonfiction book proposal, which I then took to the Willamette Writers Conference in order to get a literary agent. And once I started doing my nonfiction book proposal, I started seeing the whole world in nonfiction book proposals, right? It's like it's a structure, you can learn it, and once you have it down, you can't stop seeing the world that way. So that was really fun. That was a packed room. And I got to just talk to people about how they take that little kernel of an idea and kind of flesh it out into something that is really compelling for complete strangers on the other side of the world sometimes. I really enjoyed that one. And so this time I'm kind of going back to my roots, my writing roots for many years now. I think I'm going on 8 or 9 years in blogging. It's something that I played around with when I first moved to Oregon. In the years since, I've probably had 6 or 7 different blogs, and I currently have 5 blogs going. So blogs are also, they're a structure like any other structure. They're a structure that can be learned, and where there's approach and some best practices. So with my blogging class, since my professional background is in magazine writing, I conceive my blogging class the way, and any blog for that matter, the way a magazine editor would conceive a magazine. So we talk a lot about audience, we talk about how do you decide who you're writing for, how do you craft content based on whose eyes you want to attract, how do you kind of shape an editorial vision based on what readers want and need and find compelling. So it's a lot of information, and I'm going to do my best to pack it in as best as I can in the hour that I have. But when I leave the visitors to Terroir, the last slide that I have is kind of like, this is your homework, this is your jumping off point. So my hope is that people will always come, get inspired, and then leave with a good action plan where they can actually take like good steps. So that's what I'm doing this year.
Can you, because we're talking about blogging here, can you just off the top of your head tell me, do you remember what was your first blog? Was it, what was it about that first one that made you think, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to make this blog?
So I've had some good blogs and I've had some really bad blogs. I had a really bad blog when I was in grad school. I often bring it up, like I keep it out there, like I haven't taken it down, just as an example of all the things that you're not supposed to do. So I can't really count that one. The one that I would count is the one that I started in Salem, the Desperately Seeking Salem, because that's the one where I had a very specific point of view. I was writing with a purpose. There was a reason for that blog, and the reason was that I was super lonely. I just moved to Oregon. I had no way of connecting with anybody. The economy had just tanked. It was December of 2008. I wasn't sure that I was going to be able to get a job. I thought maybe I wanted to freelance write, but how do you move to a new area and start freelancing? So that first blog that I wrote it was really simple. It was like 10 reasons we moved to Oregon. And the reasons now strike me as, these are not reasons that you move across the country. Right? like you have to be a complete idiot to move across the country, to be somewhere where it's green, right? Like that's not a reason to move.
Well, that's why I moved.
Right. Right, but like I wanted to send my children to the German American School of Portland, but we weren't living in Portland, and also we didn't have any kids. So, I mean, it was like the pie in the sky thoughts of, a 28-year-old. But I put it out there, and it was kind of earnest and precious, and people were so kind, and people found it, and they commented, and they welcomed me, and considering that I didn't know anybody at the time, it was a great way to connect with people in a place where I was, stranger in a strange land.
And now you're here.
And now I'm here.
You're involved with this new program, the Word Studio. It's a series of workshops. Can you tell us about Word Studio and how it originated?
I'm really excited about Word Studio. I'm actually very proud of it. It's one of those things that kind of emerged naturally, and which has kind of taken off on its own. So Word Studio is a series of writing workshops that we're having in Yamhill County. We're having 5 this year, and it's supported by a grant from the Oregon Community Foundation. Basically, we were noticing with Terroir that it happens once a year. It kind of comes out of nowhere. Everyone gets excited, and then nothing for another year. You can keep some of that excitement going on Facebook a little bit, but it's not really the same as like gathering people in a space to talk about writing. So Lisa Weidman and I got together. She's another member of the board, and she's the director of the journalism school right now at Linfield. We got together, and last summer we wrote a grant to the Oregon Community Foundation, and we got $3,000 to put on this writing workshop series. And the way we conceived it, there's five writers who are local, who are holding 4-week workshops. It's pretty inexpensive. I think they're about $75 a piece. And they're in memoir writing, personal essay writing, poetry, flash fiction, I think we have historical fiction and then blogging. We might have 6 now. So there's really, if there's a genre out there that you're interested in, there's something similar going on in these word studio workshops. And the other cool thing about them is that they're happening in local spaces. So mine actually started at Flag and Wire, but it ended up at the coffee house. But it ended up being a little too noisy, so we moved it to Maria Stewart's wine bar, which it's so dreamy to be able to talk about writing in a wine bar, and all of the classes are happening like that. So we're just thrilled that we have this opportunity here to create something that happens here in Yamhill County that provides something terribly needed in this community, so that people don't have to drive to Portland in order to feel like they're a part of things.
So with McMinnville Community Media and local writer Steve Long has a show called The Writing Life, and apparently you were recently interviewed on there. So what is your take on that, The Writing Life, being interviewed, and then this experience of self-isolation for the sake of communication?
I think what he's doing is absolutely wonderful. It's really, really needed, not just for other people to be exposed to writing and to writers, but also for the writers. Not even to have the exposure, but just to have the experience of having someone ask about your work and forcing you to articulate it in a way that other people understand. I mean, that's excellent practice, and it's also very self-affirming. And it's really important. It's important to be able to talk about your work. If you're just at your desk all day long, as many of us are, kind of interacting with the page or the screen, then you forget that there's a person on the other side, or you get kind of lost in the imagination. So having these opportunities to see that person on the other side and to connect in a real way over a piece of art or a piece of writing, that's a really powerful thing. It's a powerful thing personally, and it's a powerful thing for building this community that we want.
So Emily, tomorrow at Terroir, what is it when someone looks at the list and says, I'm going to go take this blogging workshop, what is it you want them to keep just at the forefront of their minds when they walk in that door to that workshop? What should be...
So the thing about blogging is you can do it a little or you can do it a lot. And if you want to do it well, you kind of need a really, really good game plan. So my job is to kind of prepare people for that path. However, there are people who are blogging full-time at their job, and there are people who blog maybe once a year, and they're both blogging. And most of us are going to fall somewhere in the middle. So with my students, I try to reiterate over and over and over again that this is a beast that you feed, and the beast can be as little as you want. It could be a little chihuahua of a blog, or it could be like a giant Newfoundland of a blog, and you get to decide. That's the best part about blogging, is you set the parameters for your blog success. You decide, is this blog achieving what I want it to achieve? There's no comparing of blogs. There's so many blogs out there. I think on WordPress alone, about 500,000 blogs posts are written every day just on the WordPress platform. So it's really not a business you want to get into if you're comparing your success to other people.
So wrapping this up, I have one question for you. So a time machine shows up. You are able to send one message back in time to yourself. So what age do you choose? What age do you go back to, and what would that message be to yourself?
So the thing that I'm learning about myself as I get older is everything that I'm interested in, I was interested in 4th grade. 4th grade was a really seminal year for me. It seems like everything, my obsessions have not changed. They've just gotten more prominent, and they appear at different times in my life. I could give you a lot of examples, but I would go back and I would tell her, I think most people would say, write it down, right? Like, write down the thoughts that you're having. But I know myself, and I know I probably wouldn't have done that at that age. So knowing that, I think I would just say to pay attention, to really pay attention to those things that are interesting you. And maybe write down what's interesting you.
All right, well, thank you, Emily, for joining us on Literally Literary, and we look forward to seeing you at the festival tomorrow.
Thank you.
Creative Writing Festival. And I am making or renewing acquaintances. It's great for me to see familiar and friendly faces and new faces. So thank you. So I've just got some housekeeping to do. Number one on everyone's mind is where are the bathrooms. So they're right over here, and then on up, obviously just the ground floor and then on up. And where are the elevators? You'll be maybe doing some hiking. Stairs at either end, but elevators down here as well. If you want to tweet about your experience today, it's, yeah. So TCWF16, which is easy to translate. Yeah. We have, you may have seen some cool raffle prizes. And so you're going to learn more about that. But I think you have tickets, and I think you can also purchase tickets. So keep an eye out for that. This is slightly confusing, at least it is to me, but here I go. Coffee cups and paper plates go in the trash, not the recycling. And you'll see that you'll have an evaluation form to comment at the end. And that was one of the things that we've gotten, at least last year, maybe a couple of years now, is why don't we recycle more or better? The answer is we're working on it. The cups and plates that we have, for some reason, aren't recyclable. And that's one of the... They don't recycle? Okay. Now, you will see that there are some bins at either end, and then you can put in your napkins. And this says brown bags. I thought we got a box. I thought the lunch came in a box. But in any event, that brown paper can go in these. We are working with Ecology to put some supplies next year that can be recycled. So hang in there with us. And I really want to thank McMinnville Zero Waste, because they're the folks who provided these and kind of gave us some guidance. You may want to purchase books, and Scylla from the Third Street Books has those out there. You can do that at any time, and you can kind of track down the author if you'd like to do that and get them to sign. There is, I think, a book signing period, but you know, after their presentation, or if you see them roaming around, you can get a book and have them sign it. Okay, so it's not a time, it's after their presentation. Okay. Okay. Get them. We have a sign-up sheet out here for open mic, and that's kind of the last event of the day. And if you have some work, if you brought some work, or in fact, if you create some work during the day and want to read that, there's an opportunity. I would just ask that you be respectful of the time. War and Peace would be like an example of long. You know, a joke would be an example of short. Kind of falling in somewhere. And I now want to present Monica Setzel Phillips. I don't know if you know this young lady, but she is a renowned artist in town. Yeah, you said not to say that, so that made me say it. And she's also, I wrote this and I thought, well, this is so writerly. Monica is a faithful explorer in the Terroir fields. Thank you so much.
I get to stand on my tiptoes again. I always seem to get there. Okay. I want to tell you about 2 raffles. Every year we have costs that are not covered by registration. And so we put together a raffle. Actually, we have some really good raffle items this year, and I hope you come to the raffle table between classes and take a look. Raffle tickets are $5 a piece, and we're drawing by number, so you don't need to fill it out with your name or anything. And the raffle will be held just before the beginning of the afternoon session. And you do have to be present to win. So I'm hoping that many of you will decide to take that chance and buy a raffle ticket and win a wonderful, we actually have 4 different, we have 5 different raffle items, 3 baskets, a tray with goodies, and a beautiful, beautiful box with a handmade journal that Marilyn Warwick donated to us. So there's some wonderful things out there. Go take a look. Also, this year, I would like to, YCCC, the Yamhill County Cultural Coalition, we are producing a survey, and I'd like to introduce Deborah Weiner, who's going to tell you about it.
This year, the Yamhill County Cultural Coalition is conducting an economic study of of the impact of arts and culture, and we're asking for your help in filling out a very short survey that most of you will find in your packets, not all, but most of you. In collaboration with the Oregon Arts Commission and Americans for the Arts, 13 sites in Oregon are joining 280 others across the country to participate in the survey, and results will come back to us next year. If you complete your survey, please turn it in with the half of your raffle ticket that's at the top in the basket at the very end on the right-hand end of the raffle table, and keep the other half of the ticket. After lunch, we'll draw a winning survey ticket and be pleased to present one of you with this wonderful spring basket that includes flowers, handmade napkins, cocoa-dusted hazelnuts, jam, a big flyer from our steward, and filling out the survey should take you less time than me telling you about it. Thank you. Yes. You might borrow somebody who doesn't want to fill out their survey. You could do it for them. But if you don't have a survey, don't worry about it. It's okay. Yeah, I know. That's what you might offer to somebody else. Thank you.
We were given a specific number of surveys, and that's why we don't all have a survey. Now, to get down to the actual wonderful event of the day. I am very excited and very pleased to introduce David Mason to you. He is a man of many accomplishments. He's a Northwesterner to start with. He's written a number of volumes of poetry. He was the Poet Laureate for the state of Colorado from 2010 to 2014. He's written poetry, prose, and translations that have appeared in numerous publications, including the New York Times, the New Yorker, Yale Review, and the Southern Review. He's also getting into writing libretti, and he has written librettos for The Scarlet Letter with composer Lori Laitman, and that will be premiering in Denver very, very soon, in a couple weeks, May 7th, in a couple weeks. He's also, there's a work in progress with her based on his verse novel, Ludlow. And that is also with Lori Laitman. Then he has also written a libretto based on, it's a conversation.
Pablo Picasso and Gertrude.
Yeah, Pablo, it's absolutely wonderful libretto. Great music, but wonderful libretto. Pablo Picasso and Gertrude Stein, Conversation. And that was premiered in San Francisco and Seattle, and it just finished a run in Washington, D.C. He has published 2 new books of poetry in 2014 and 2015. Sea Salt, A Poetry of a Decade, and Davy McGravy, which is delightful, Tales to be Read Aloud to Children and Adult Children. So it is my very great privilege and pleasure to introduce to you David Mason. That he now spends his time in 2 states. He lives part of the year in Colorado, where he teaches at Colorado College, and then he has a wonderful home in Newport.
Thank you, Monica. And thanks to Lisa and everyone who did such a splendid job of organizing this amazing festival. It's really a privilege to be here. This is the first literary event I've done in my new home, Oregon. So I'm glad to have it with such a wonderful looking group. I'm going to do something perverse to start off. I'm going to ask all of you to do something that maybe you're unaccustomed to. I want you to all say a poem aloud with me, all right? It's not going to kill you. It's very short, and it's very easy to get through. I say a line, you repeat it. I say another line, you repeat it, and we all come out alive on the other side, okay? Yeah, you ready? How many miles to Babylon?
How many miles to Babylon?
70 miles and 10.
70 miles and 10.
Can I get there by candlelight?
Can I get there by candlelight?
Yes, and back again.
Yes, and back again.
If your heels are nimble and light,
If your heels are nimble and light,
you can get there by candlelight.
you can get there by candlelight.
Not bad. That's a great poem. That's by one of the greatest poets in the English language, Mother Goose. I mean that very profoundly. Think about what kind of a poem that is. There's somebody talking, somebody asking the question, how many miles to Babylon? That sounds like a question a child might ask. I had a granddaughter once saying to me from the back seat of the car, "Grandpa, do you live in the sky?" And I had to think about that for a little while. And I realized that every time they went to get Grandpa Dave, it was at the airport, and they'd be pointing up saying, "There's Grandpa coming in." And so it was a perfectly logical question for her to ask. "Grandpa, do you live in the sky? How many miles to Babylon?" What a question. Where's Babylon? It's in Iraq. It's in Mesopotamia. It's a literal place. It's a tell, a ruin. Saddam Hussein was rebuilding it until coalition troops rolled their tanks over it about a decade ago. But it's not just a place in Mesopotamia. It's a word. It's a word that's used in the Bible. It's a word that's used in many hymns. By the waters of Babylon, I sat down and wept. It's a word Rastafarians use to talk about the white world. That's Babylon, the world of power and money and banks. It's a science fiction TV series. It's a rock group. It's all sorts of things. So Babylon is this word that, for all we know, just means Babylon. Babylon, right? It's a word, the meaning of which we cannot anchor. We cannot know with absolute certainty. The question is, how far is it to Babylon? Maybe that's a child's question. The answer given in the next line is 70 miles and 10. 70 and 10. That's from the Bible too. Hausman echoes it when he says, "Now of my 70 and 10, 20 shall not come again." 70 and 10 is 70. It's what the Bible says is the lifespan of a person. 70 years. Now something amazing just happened in this children's poem, and I want to suggest to you that literature doesn't ever really get more profound than this. That Mother Goose is about as profound as literature ever gets. The question was, how far is it to a destination the meaning of which we cannot know? The answer was, it's your life. You see what happened? The question was about distance. The answer was about time. And in that space that's opened up between distance and time is what we call imagination. It's what we call the imaginal. That is the space in which we are most human, in which we are most alive in our connections to the world. Somebody once asked James Joyce, the great novelist, what's imagination? And James Joyce's answer was memory. Think about where your stories come from. Think about what you think memory is. Think about your memory of any event in your family's history, an argument, a death, a meal. Now ask your siblings or your relatives what their memory of that story is, and you're going to find out they don't have the same memory you do. Right? In other words, every time you remember, you are imagining. This is why history and fiction are very much the same thing. And true. The Greek word historia simply means story. It's a story. So I want to talk to you this morning about stories, and I want to read some brief excerpts from some stories and just sort of talk about what I think it is we're doing, whether we're writing creative nonfiction, or whether we're writing fiction or drama, or even poetry. A lot of the poetry I've written is storytelling poetry, narrative poetry. It's really important that we understand this enterprise as something that children are absolutely masters of, quite adept at, and that somehow or another we get ourselves educated out of in the course of our lives. And when we go back and become storytellers again, we've got to locate that child who plays all the parts in the little game with dolls or toy soldiers or trucks or building the dam with a wall of mud and sticks. The child creates all the voices. The child lives and dies when the child is playing that game. Willa Cather, the great novelist, said, "Art is a concrete and personal and rather childish thing after all. No matter what people do to graft it into science and make it sociological or psychological, it's no good at all unless it is let alone to be itself, a game of make-believe, of reproduction, very exciting and delightful to people who have an ear for it or an eye for it." So I want to argue that the skill you need to be a writer is the skills you were developing pretty much when you were about 5 years old. There are things you can do with language and things you can learn about technique, etc. But the first and most fundamental thing is you've got to play all the parts. You've got to become all the people and do it convincingly. About 2 weeks ago, I was at a convention in Los Angeles for creative writers. A convention of 12,000 creative writers. It's a horrifying thought. My wife and I spent most of the time cowering in our hotel room. Anyway, I was on a panel of poets talking about writing in voices of characters. Dramatic monologues, persona poems, that sort of thing. And toward the end of the panel, we were asked a question that we didn't have time sufficiently to answer. A young woman in the audience said, "Well, what should I study in order to be able to write the kinds of poems you guys are writing? How can I learn this technique?" If I had had a chance to answer that question, what I would have said is, remember what you were as a kid. Play all the parts. Make them up. I was talking that day about a poem in two voices, a poem in which a drunkard bursts in on the home of a rather effete gay shopkeeper and confesses to him that he's just committed a murder. And in the course of the poem, you find out why this has happened. Well, it turns out that that shopkeeper and that drunkard, although some may disagree, are nothing like me. I made them up. I spoke in their voices, very much as a child would. And that's what you've got to do when you're a writer. Reading and writing are the same activity. I worry most about my students when I realize that they're not creating a little theater in their heads. They're not seeing the scenes that they're reading about and playing the parts and moving their lips when they read. By God, move your lips when you read. And ideally, read it out loud. And make it part of the theater of your life. As Cormac McCarthy says, each man is the bard of his own existence. This is how he is joined to the world. We have to honor the imaginal life in other people, and we have to understand that everybody we write about has an imaginal life that he or she may have trouble coming into contact with, but it's there, it's valid, and it's real. A couple of other quick points before I show you some examples of what I mean. There's a great short story I was thinking of. I think of this story a lot, by the 19th century French author Guy de Maupassant, called Mother Savage. The story that begins in the countryside in France, and this would probably be in the late 1870s, after the Franco-Prussian War. Two men are walking through the countryside, which they love deeply. They know it from childhood. It's a place that they have an intimate connection to. And there's a lovely image of one of the men. You can imagine him holding his hunting rifle, approaching the other friend, and he walks like a stork. You can imagine the long, deliberate steps of the man walking through the underbrush as he approaches his friend, because his friend has just discovered the ruins of an old house that evidently burned down. And the other man is able to tell him the story of what happened in this house. The house belonged to a woman who's now known as Mother Savage. She had a son who went away to fight the Hun in the Franco-Prussian War. And meanwhile, the Germans captured that part of France, and 3 German soldiers were billeted in her house. Mother Savage took care of those men. She fed them. She made sure they had a good place to sleep in the attic of the house. She felt toward them as a mother would toward her own children. And the Germans loved her and toasted her at dinner and thought of her as a friend. And then one day, Mother Savage got the news that her son had been killed in battle, rather horribly. A cannonball had cut him in half. And Mother Savage went and sat down on a stump in the yard and contemplated what had happened, and then went back into her house where the Germans were billeted and waited until they were asleep. She'd fed them and they'd gone upstairs to sleep, and she set the house on fire and burned it all down. And there's a great moment at the end of the story when you realize this is the way in which we understand the savagery and totality of her grief. She wants to destroy everything. And there it is, that burned house in the countryside. And the narrator of the story reaches down in the ground in the last sentence of the story and picks up, I brought a little volcanic stone here because it's black, but he's picking up a charred stone from the earth and holding it in his hand. That's the story. You get it? That's the story. He's holding it in his hand, the burned stone from Mother Savage's house. When you have a story, you can hold it just like that. You can hold it for decades. You can walk around with it, carry it in your pocket until you're ready to write it. And you know you're ready to write it when you've got a couple of things happening. One of the things you've got to have is a voice. And one of the things you've got to have is a place. That beloved countryside, or that beloved city, or that beloved room, whatever it is, that place is of absolute importance to the story you're going to tell. But who's telling the story? And why? And who's hearing the story? And why? Those are extremely important questions. And sometimes you have to wait a long time until you know the answers to those questions. So until you're ready to tell that story. So I want to talk about 2 stories I've written and how I came to write them, and a little bit about how they're written as examples of this process. I think about, when I talk to students about storytelling, I think about what Kurt Vonnegut once said in an interview. He said, whatever you do, make your characters want something, even if it's just a glass of water. But you gotta have some vector of desire, some reason for moving into this story, some reason for opening the door in a certain place and walking into it. Ernest Hemingway's great novel about the Spanish Civil War, For Whom the Bell Tolls, has the simplest plot imaginable. Page 1, chapter 1, there's a guy lying on the floor of the pine needle floor of the forest. He's looking through binoculars. He's with an old Spaniard. You discover that they're looking at a bridge. 400 pages later, they blow up the bridge. That's the story. There it is. There's a vector. There's a directional line through the story. Hemingway's got the luxury of slowing down and moving about in time and space precisely because we all want to see that bridge get blown up, or we want to find out what happens at the bridge. And so what I'm suggesting to you is that there's a way in which that's the pebble Hemingway's holding as he works for a full year scratching out this story, this novel, vowing that he's not even going to get a haircut till he's got the damn thing done. You know? And that's a good thing to have if you're a writer. That sense that, well, I may not know all the things I know about my story. I might not know how it ends. I might not know all kinds of things. I might not know who lives, who dies, who falls in love, who doesn't. But I know there's something that's a hook, that's a line that's pulling you through that story. Well, I've written a number of narrative poems, and this book, Ludlow, is a kind of a novel, kind of an epic poem. I was aware as I wrote it that I had a linear path I could follow that set me free as a writer. I just want to talk to you about that a little bit. The story is basically about an historical event, an actual thing that happened April 20th, 1914. A war broke out in southern Colorado, where my father grew up, even though I grew up in Bellingham, Washington. I had a lot of family history in Colorado. A war broke out between immigrants and the people who were there before. It was a profoundly racist war. If you went into a train station in Walsenburg, Colorado, you might see a sign that said, "This waiting room is for Americans only. No Irish, Italians, Mexicans, Greeks, etc." Okay? That's American history, ladies and gents. It's also Oregon's history, very profoundly. What happened was that the Union was, corrupt and run by a bunch of drunken thieves, and it was trying to get a toehold in this struggle between immigrants and the Rockefeller family and their minions who owned the coal mines and the steel mills of southern Colorado. And eventually, after a lot of shootouts and killings and beatings, the ineffectual governor of the state, a guy named Ammons, called out the National Guard. And because the state of Colorado was bankrupt, it couldn't afford to pay the National Guard. So Rockefeller's minions said, well, we'll pay him. And you can guess that rather quickly the National Guard knew which side it was on. And you had heavily armed camps on all sides. You had Greeks who fought the Turks and Bulgarians in the Balkan Wars, and who knew very well how to kill people. And you had heavily armed American soldiers, and you had sides that absolutely hated each other. You had American soldiers, some of whom had fought in the Philippine War, and had fought in Mexico, and who hated dark-skinned people. All that was not going to end very well, right? April 20th, 1914, the Ludlow Massacre. A full day, a pitched battle in the plains of southern Colorado that ended with about 25 people dead, but the real horror was that most of them were women and children who were in a pit under one of the tents in the strikers' camp and who suffocated when the camp was set on fire and the tents burned. It became a cause célèbre. Upton Sinclair and the Union and all sorts of other people talked about Ludlow. Woody Guthrie wrote a song about Ludlow, etc. I came to the story in childhood. I remembered my father and my uncles pointing out the mesas and the buttes as we drove past them and saying, that's where the National Guard opened up with machine guns on the strikers. And my relatives were very, very angry about what had happened there. Many years passed. I had a little pebble in my pocket. I never knew I was going to write about Ludlow. I didn't know that this was my story or one of my stories. I had an uncle who was moving to Ireland and was giving away some of his books when he moved, and he handed me one book and said, "You ever read this?" It was George McGovern's PhD dissertation in history, which had been turned into a more popular book called The Great Coalfield War. and it was McGovern's account of the Ludlow Massacre. So I read that book and I thought, damn, who knew, you know? I didn't know there was so much going on in this story. I didn't know that in one sense this story is the American epic. It is the American story in a pretty profound way. Lots and lots of people involved in this from all kinds of racial and ethnic backgrounds. Years after that, I read another book by a guy named Zeus Papanikolaou, who lives in Oakland, California. And Zeus was the man who discovered the identity of one of the martyrs of Ludlow. A man who grew up in a village of Crete. His name was Elias Panidakis. And in America, he took the name Louis Tikas. And Louis Tikas was a union organizer who was trying to keep the peace on the day of the massacre and was shot in the back by the Colorado militia, executed in the course of the day-long fight. Zeus found Louis' grave, found the coroner's report. With Zeus's research and information, there are now streets named after Louis Tikas in Crete. There are monuments in his house in the little village of Loutra. The Greeks know all about him. Well, when I read that book, I realized, you know what? I was born to tell this story. It happens that I've lived in Greece, and I speak Greek, and I've lived with a lot of Greek immigrants. And at the time I was married to a Scottish immigrant. I'm now married to an Australian immigrant, so I seem to have a thing about immigrants. I had the accents of Scotland under my roof when I was taking care of my mother-in-law as she descended into Alzheimer's. I realized then that I held that story in my hand absolutely as much as I could hold this pebble in my hand. I had been living away from the West for 20 years. I lived in New York and Greece and Minnesota. I wanted to write about the West again. I wanted to write about El Rio de las Animas Perdidas en Purgatorio, which is where my father grew up, the river of lost souls in purgatory, which flows through Trinidad, Colorado, from the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, the Blood of Christ Mountains. I wanted to write about El Huérfano, the orphan, this butte of rock that rises up from the country. And I, in fact, nicknamed one of my major characters after that butte of rock. They call her La Huérfana, the orphan. I realized in chapter 1, as I was writing chapter 1, that she was about to be orphaned. I didn't know that. I didn't know I was inventing a little girl who was part Mexican, part Welsh, when I wrote, "Shot firers filed in after the diggers left and found the marked drills for their measured shot. As daylight died, the men were blasting deep for the next day's cuts of coal, while down below the mesa, smells of cooking rose from shacks in rows, and there Louisa scrubbed the pot as if she were some miner's wife, and not a sapper's daughter, scrawny, barely 12. A couple of things happened to me when I sat down at a kitchen table in Minnesota and wrote those lines. One was I realized I was writing blank verse. So this is a verse novel. It's easy to read, fewer words on the page. It's a page turner, I guarantee you. It is not difficult to read. I'm very proud of that. But this is the verse form of Shakespeare and Milton and Robert Frost for storytelling. It's one of the major vehicles of storytelling in the English language. This prose thing so many people do, it's a newfangled invention. It can't last. So verse is one way of telling stories. The other thing I realized was that I was inventing this little girl, that she was going to be one of my major characters. I already knew I was going to write about Louis. I had my own version of Louis Tikas. He's a historical figure, but I made him a fictional character. And I realized I was going to have a Scottish immigrant. I suddenly realized in the course of chapter 1 that his name was Too Tall Macintosh, because he was too tall to work in the mines. He had a stoop. And I love Too Tall. I'll read you a little piece of Too Tall in just a second. And I also realized that I had a narrator who was absolutely free to move about in time and space in this landscape. And that for me was totally liberating. I have an omniscient narrator who sometimes becomes a sort of David Mason figure and walks into the story, and sometimes doesn't. So that this story, which happens from about 1910 really to 1915, and then suddenly leaps forward to the 1940s and leaps forward to the 1970s when Luce, as an old woman looking back on these events, is able to move about in time because of the narrative voice I've invented. I'm going to read you a little passage about Tootall to demonstrate what I mean by moving about in time and space. This is Tootall on a day in October 1913. The strike has been going for about a month. A shootout has happened. Tootall got drunk and joined the union, which has infuriated his wife. She didn't want him to do that. He was a firer. He was a demolition guy, not a union guy. What's happened is that there's been a big event down in New Mexico, and the union organizer, John Lawson, is about to use that in a kind of propagandistic way to galvanize resistance. So it had gone some weeks now, meeting men who talked the strike away as best they could. Their women holding family life together. Men who chewed or smoked tobacco, looked down at worn boots as they listened. Some had heard how Karl Marx had a system for the poor, and how one day the revolution would upend corruption that made others rich. They talked of capital and labor. Men like that little fella, Ticus, translated for the others, listening with their eyes, their hands itching to do more than wait. Tootall saw more sorts of people than he'd ever seen. The Japanese who brought tomatoes from abandoned garden plots, the weird Greeks, the Mexicans whose wives worked the metates, and all would listen when John Lawson stood, broad-shouldered in his suit, the meeting tent jammed full of immigrants who sought good news. Now Tootall stood upright and slowly walked, feeling his disapproving wife behind his back, until he found men loitering in and out of the big tent, and Ticus in puttees and suit, barking broken orders. John Lawson strode among them, and the crowd followed him inside the tent. He took the little stage and waited for the quiet, then spoke the bad news from New Mexico. An explosion at the Dawson mine down there, with hundreds buried. Wind touched the canvas overhead, and for a moment no one stirred or shuffled, coughed or said a word. Whisht, said the wind. And Tootall thought of Mole and others who had perished in explosions, his own brain now exploding from the hooch. This man, John Lawson, had a steady voice. These are, he said, our brethren, men like you and me, who spent their whole lives in the dark, and no one knows how many are alive. These are a better reason for the pick and shovel than some black ore for a scion. I want volunteers to board the train with me. The union pays for any man who will work. And Tootall hardly thought. His stomach growled. His skull was splitting open, but he had to go. A man who barely walked, he ran now to his missus at the line, and what he felt in giving her the news was the closest thing he knew to happiness. It's work, he said. I don't know what to do with so much idleness. I'll not be long. But when the boys come home, give them a task that's closer to the tents and curry them, no knowing who's about. And even Mrs., her ferocity now gone, reached up and kissed his bearded cheek. That was a kiss he felt for 30 years or more. Days after she was buried, he stood at the gate before their wee house in Pueblo, touching the skin above his whiskers, as if his fingertips were a pair of lips and he might turn to find her there again, calling him by his real name, calling him Christy McIntosh. But she was gone, and they had never made it back to Ayrshire, never again declared a day was soft, a Sunday not for laboring. A war raged somewhere out of earshot, his own sons too old for it, thank God, but too involved with work and families of their own to stay and visit an old man in a steel town. They'd buried their mom and gone back on the train to Denver and LA. And Christy walked his hot, dry neighborhood alone each day before his lunch. Sun glint off a windshield. He turned. Some neighbor wasting ration gas. And once again his fingers touched his cheek. How soft she'd been at that goodbye. And he had never told her all about the fash of Dawson, how men climbed the scar to dig with any tool they had, The few survivors telling of a misplaced charge, the mine's mouth shooting flames out like a dragon. And now the blackened bodies hauled on tarpaulins down the stumbling slopes, the feared men stunned to silence, body after body, some with burnt arms reaching after death, the flesh in charred strips stiff on the bone and sinew. His cousins in the trenches of the Somme could run out a smell like that, perhaps. The cries of men and animals from no man's land. He saw John Lawson had to dodge the guards, and he saw Tikas, now almost famous due to Ludlow, but then an unknown dandy, work around the clock, knowing many dead were Greek, and many more from Italy. The Corbys flocked to Pinion Scrub, observing wagons loaded with the sooty sticks that once were men. 263, our brethren, Lawson said. Then Ludlow. Everything so hard and fast for months. Too few remembered now. The wars had blotted out the past, except old men like Christy McIntosh, who'd gone to work to feed his family after the whole turmoil, after the killings and the failures, after the Union sold John Lawson out, after the long, disgraceful struggle came to naught. He shoveled coke into the furnaces of Pueblo's mill until they made him lead a crew, then moved him to the office where he tallied loads of coal until retirement. 3 decades passing like a Dust Bowl cloud. A long train wailing through the arid night, freighted with lives he'd never see again. That long train hauled the grief mined from the mesas by the immigrants into a silence like forgetfulness. A gunshot? No. A neighbor's car backfired. He touched his cheek and walked into his house. Yeah. That's a minor character in the book, but I really love him. And I read in Trinidad soon after the book came out, which is just south of the Ludlow battlefield. And somebody in the audience said, "How did you research Tupel McIntosh?" And I had the pleasure of saying, "I didn't. I made him up." He's pure fiction. And I still fell in love with him and felt as if I knew him in some profound way. Because my ex-wife's father, who lived in Scotland 42 years and died in Cleveland 42 years later, was a man who, when he used the word home, always meant Scotland. He didn't mean Cleveland. So I understood something about what immigrants feel. Immigrants dream in one language and waken to another. They have one name in one place and another name in another place, and they feel divided. And I felt that myself in my life. I know what that feels like, to have an inner life that's different from your public life, etc. My narrator is able to stop the narrative about the massacre or the explosion at Dawson, which is an actual event. 263 mostly young Italian men blown up in one mine explosion. Their graves are in Dawson, New Mexico. Mostly young immigrants from Italy and Greece. He's able to stop the narrative, leap forward to the World War II era, to 1943. And old man McIntosh is walking down the street in Pueblo, remembering these events because he's remembering his wife's kiss. So my narrator is able to move about in time. It has that absolute freedom of the landscape. Not all narrators can do that, right? Most of my narrators are rather fixed in a moment of time. But that's a choice you've got to make. You got to have a place, and you got to have a voice. I'm going to finish by reading you from a children's book in which the same things are at stake. I mentioned that my wife, Chrissy, is from Australia. She's actually from Tasmania, which is the beautiful heart-shaped island off the south coast of Australia. And as it happens, when we were driving down the Oregon coast some years ago, she fell in love with this place, and because it was the only place in America that reminded her of home. You think of Australia being the sort of red earth, dry desert outback, but southeast Australia is very green. It looks like England and Wales, except for the gum trees. Looks a lot like Oregon. You can drive through the landscape I drove through this morning and imagine that you're in Tasmania without too much trouble at all. So she let me know that Colorado was okay, but she wasn't going to stay in America unless we had a home in Oregon too. So I went gulp and went heavily into debt, and unhappily so. Happily and heavily in debt. And I now have the craziest commute of anybody in America, probably. But it's a good life, in this crazy way. Well, she and I were taking a hike in Colorado soon after we first got together. And she was asking me about my father. Chrissy, I gotta tell you, her name is Chrissy Mason, but she writes under the pen name Callie Conan Davies, using her mother's maiden name. She's a great, great, great poet. Everybody she knows gets a nickname. So her daughter, whose name is Rain Allenson, is called Winnie. Go figure. I mean, there's a long story behind that. But everybody has more than one name in Chrissy's world. So she turns to me on the path as we're hiking along and says, did anybody ever give you a nickname? Did anybody ever call you anything but Dave or David? And I said, well, you know, my dad once ruffled my hair and called me Davy McGravy. And she stopped dead in her tracks, turned around, looked at me, and said, that's who you are. You are Davy McGravy. Your father saw you, she said. He saw who you really are. You're Davy McGravy. And then she said, you have to write about that. That's a book. That's a book. You have to write that. You have to write that. And then, of course, now, as any obliging husband would be, I had to figure out how to write the book. But once again, okay, so you got that stone you're carrying around, right? How am I going to know I'm ready to write the story? How am I going to know what Davy McGravy is? Well, I knew Ludlow was my story about the West. I knew it was my story about Colorado and that ancestral landscape with all the Spanish names and all that sort of thing. But I grew up in rain country, and I write more often about the Pacific Northwest than I do about any other landscape. And so I had a dim feeling that my landscape was going to be this landscape, or one very much like it. But what was my voice going to be? What was my voice going to be? How many miles to Babylon? 70 miles of 10. Can I get there by candlelight? Yes, and back again. If your heels are nimble and light, you can get there by candlelight. I kept thinking about the sort of candlelit world of imagination, of needing to be light on one's feet, needing to be playful, even when what you're contemplating might have something to do with grief. Here's what I first wrote, where I found the voice of the book. This is a novella, but it's also in verse. I'm a perverse fellow. And it's also a page turner. And I didn't know what my story was yet. But it turns out my story was a little bit related to the Ludlow story. The first little section is called To Love. May I call you love? Very well then. You are love. And this is a tale about a boy named Davy. Never mind the rest of his name. You need only know he was born in the land of rain and the tallest of tall trees, great shaggy cedars like the boots of giants covered in green. Where the giants had gone, no one could ever tell. Only their boots remained on the wet green grass, surrounded by ferns on the shore of a long, cold, windy lake. That's where Davy was born, love. That's where you must imagine him. A wee squall of tears and swaddling, a babe, as you too were a babe, with parents and the whole canoe, the whole catastrophe we call a family, the human zoo. I realized a couple of things in that. I realized that just like the Mother Goose poem, I had a storyteller who was talking to a child or an adult child. I had a place, I had a storytelling voice, and I had an implied listener to the story. The implication is that these are out loud stories. In this sense, they're just like Kipling's Tanglewood Tales or Just So stories or lots and lots of books for young people that at least play the game of being read out loud, whether they are being read out loud or not. I realized that child and adult child have very particular meanings in our culture. And I realized that Davy McGravy had a mother with a problem, rather like my very own mother, who had a problem with addiction. Davy's mother disappears in a profound and unexplained fog. The book's been widely reviewed everywhere in the country, and all the critics have assumed that the mother dies. But the book never says she's dead.
Yeah.
It simply says she disappeared in a fog. That's all it says. She's gone, she's missing. And that's what Davy's stuck with, and what his brothers are stuck with. Davy also has the misfortune to be a middle child. I was a middle child, it's a terrible lot. And you get it from both sides. And Davy's brothers can't stand him. His older brother picks on him. His younger brother sits around sucking his thumb and imitating the older brother. And one day in the first chapter of this book, there's a little moment when Father comes home from work and is frying a trout in a pan for the evening supper. And he turns and sees Davy and ruffles his hair and gives him the name, Davy McGravy. And you realize that that's, in a sense, Davy's salvation, that he's been seen, he's been named. And his name rhymes. And one of the wonderful things for me about the story is that as Davy moves out into the world, and as his world grows, as he encounters different aspects of life, including bullies in school and all sorts of other things, he is aware of little correspondences in the world, little ways in which the world rhymes, in which things in the world are connected to each other. He has this sensitivity, and he sees things that nobody else can see, and he's pretty damn sure he can fly, too, which is another way that people make fun of him. So he's an imaginative little boy who's kind of wronged by his encounters with the real world. I'm going to read you just a section of Davy, and then we'll call it quits, and if there's a minute and anybody wants to ask a question, we can do it. This is from the second chapter called Davy's Blue Monday, when he's gone out walking in the woods, and he's having all these encounters, and he's about to have a very strange encounter, which is the sort of encounter you can only have in a children's book, which is one of the things that gave me a lot of pleasure in writing this book. He wandered to see around the bend, and another bend after that, and the winding trail went on through the woods, and walking lightened his heart. It was good to be alone. No brothers to tell him he was dumb for saying what he saw, alone with his rhyming name. He could stay in the woods all day if he wished, and when his father came home at the end of day with another fish, Davy would come home too. And he wasn't really lost in the woods. He heard the lake behind him and saw the trail ahead, winding and winding. He stepped on a giant cedar log, wet and rotting on the ground. The wood was soft beneath his shoes and made a squishy sound. So he stopped and touched it with his hand and saw his skin dyed red. This is what happens to trees, he thought, when they are dead. They fall apart in the forest until they become like dirt, a wet hotel for beetles, and it doesn't really hurt. The lake at his back was quiet now. The mist high up in the trees was like wet smoke from an ancient fire back in the giants' days. Somewhere ahead was another sound of water in the woods. Beyond that sound was the strangest call Davy had ever heard. He followed the water sound. That's often a good idea. And the trail turned up a hill, and the dark woods suddenly cleared. And there was a cliff of smooth, wet rock and a splashing pool, and above the pool a glimmering waterfall, so clear and cool, like quiet laughter in the day falling from above. The water fell and mosses clung to the rocks like love. Old logs lay across the stream. Mosses loved them too. Davy McGravy laughed at the sight and knew what he had to do. He climbed on a wet log over the pool and hugged the trunk like his father's leg and lay with his cheek on a pillow of moss to watch the water bugs. He watched them move on the surface, then saw deeper in where minnows darted among the rocks, so pale and thin. Now, all is now, said a quiet voice within. And then the strangest thing he'd ever heard, that call again. Beyond the laughing waterfall, beyond the waving trees, beyond the shifting of the rocks, a high-pitched, plaintive, please! And here! 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 And please! The strangest call he'd ever heard was carried on the breeze. It wasn't quite a whistle. There wasn't really a squawk. The last thing Davy expected to see in the woods was a peacock. But there it sat in a fir tree not 20 feet away. This Blue Monday was proving to be an extraordinary day. The peacock perched on a fir bough, lording it over the woods, its blue head calling, please, and here, perfectly understood. And rising behind the peacock, from a most magnificent tail, a fan of eyes were watching the boy by the waterfall. Davy sat up with a start. He straddled the log and looked at the feathered king of the fir trees. For a moment his body shook. What do you want me to hear? He asked. Did you run off from a farm? Or how did you ever get here? The bird said, don't be alarmed. Or maybe it said nothing. Maybe it was the breeze. Maybe the bird was calling, please, oh, please, oh, please. But the way it puffed out its breast and the way its eyes looked on at the boy and the log by the waterfall was something to think upon. Why shouldn't a peacock talk if there's somebody present to listen? Maybe the whole world is talking, and people just miss it. Oh, please, the bird said again, and don't be alarmed, my boy. Finding a peacock in the fir should fill you with joy. Davy stood up on the log and crossed on the bank of the stream and sat on a mossy stone. Was this a dream? Was he napping beside the water? Was he walking in his sleep? Had the whole of this Blue Monday never been his to keep? Don't fret over that, said the bird. He must have read his thought. Everything always happens as if it had not. Am I real or aren't I? Don't you believe my eyes? I'm the king of the fir trees, and these are my spies. With that, the bird fanned out his tail in a shimmering feather rainbow and stared with all of his eyes at little Davy below. I know who you are, said the bird. You're the boy with the rhyming name. I think I've been dreaming of you in your house by the lake. My eyes are a kind of rhyme. Can you see? Side by side and nearly the same. I have rainbow eyes. Do you think it will rain? And rain is a kind of rhyme. So are two halves of a leaf. And maybe you walked out in the woods to rhyme away your grief. Where's my mother? Davy asked, as rain began to fall. From the blue-gray clouds above the woods, the drops were cold and small. Lost in a fog, the peacock said. But nothing is really lost. Look at the trees in the forest, beloved by the moss. Davy McGravy, quite a name, and I see it fits you well. You're a boy who rhymes, and a boy who sees things, clear as a bell. The rain fell heavier from the cloud and danced on the minnow pool and water on the mossy rocks and fell and fell and fell. It's late, said the bird. You should go home. Your father will soon be back, and day will end and night will come, moonless and black. Remember your name, my boy. Remember who you are. Remember the forest sees you, and when there are no stars, remember the web that touched you, light as a mother's touch, your meal of huckleberries, the moss like a couch. And when your brothers are grumpy, constantly calling you dumb, when big brother says, don't say that, and little brother sucks his thumb, there's somewhere you won't be lonely, a waterfall out in the woods, and maybe you'll talk to a peacock and find yourself understood. Most likely you won't, said the bird. I'm old, and I realize it isn't every day you meet a bird with 200 eyes. At that, the bird unfanned its tail and closed both eyes in its head. Time for us both to go back to our homes, the nodding peacock said. Well, I think I'll call it quits there, and we have just a few minutes, maybe 5 minutes, if anybody does want to ask a question or two. Always the awkward moment. Yeah, go ahead.
What type of verse did you say that was? Like
Davy McGravy?
Well, no, I mean the. I apologize.
Yeah, that's okay. The Ludlow book?
Not even that. Because it rhymes half the time, but the other half it does not rhyme. What is that style called?
Well, this book is written in blank verse, in which the norm is a pentameter line. So if I say, shot firers filed in after the diggers left, notice I'm not footnoting any of those difficult words. I'm allowing my reader to imagine what those words are. That's about an 11-syllable line, and it's not a normative pentameter line yet. Shot firers filed in after the diggers left and found the marked drills for their measured shot. That's getting a little closer to pentameter. And then the next line is, as daylight died, the men were blasting deep. Suddenly I've got a regular iambic pentameter line. As daylight died, the men were blasting deep. What that's doing is that's like the chord, the musical chord that's sounding the norm for the verse form in the book. But the book varies that verse form radically all over the place. And so I don't want you to settle into a regular pattern. Blank verse is handy for telling stories because it's big enough, it's long enough to leave you space to move around in, like prose, but it's also contained, so it feels like the banks of a river containing those energies. Davy McGravy starts in these short lines, sometimes kind of 4-beat, sometimes kind of 3-beat and even shorter, often unrhymed, and then what happens is it begins to move more into a more deliberately rhymed verse as the novel moves on. And by the end, you're pretty confidently in a ballad measure, a lot like The Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner by Coleridge, if you've ever read that poem. It's pretty much the same kind of storytelling verse. Yeah. Ballads are really great for storytelling. It's a natural measure for it, as Bob Dylan can tell you. Great question. Yeah. When did I first start writing? At the age of 4, I was aware that I could write my name, and I remember standing next to a kitchen table because a little girl next door didn't believe I really knew how to write my name, so I was proving to her that I could write my name. So that's when I first started writing. Yeah, and I've been writing stuff ever since. Just most of it horrible. I started publishing in my early 20s, but I don't want to look back at most of that stuff. It's one of the things about publishing. I was in a big hurry to prove myself and publish stuff in my 20s, and I now warn my students, don't be in too big a hurry. You don't necessarily want to see everything in print. Any other questions? Yeah.
How do you push yourself to go deeper? Like sometimes something seems too easy or it's too cliched. How do you push yourself to look deeper?
It's so important. I'm not sure I actually have a trick for this. What my wife calls it is, she calls it the cold work. That is, say you've written something, you've written a draft of something, but you know there's something lurking that you haven't touched yet. Watching her revise is the most inspiring thing I've ever seen. She works harder at her poems than anybody I've ever known. But she really just coldly interrogates what's going on in every word. And in any one of her poems, she knows the etymological history of every single word she's used. She knows every layer of meaning. And I've never been that kind of a writer. I'm always somebody who just kind of has an idea and runs with it, pours something out, and then really has to sit with it for a long time and really struggle to figure out whether I've got the story or not. For example, I wrote a story, a piece of prose fiction that's based on an actual family event, and an editor I sent it to, who decided that he can't use it, likes the way it's written, but he thinks I ought to rewrite it as nonfiction. He thinks it really is nonfiction, and that somehow or another I haven't gone the extra step of separating myself from the story and going into the realm of fiction in the thing. So that's an interesting place to be with a piece of writing. My choice now is, can I push myself further into the realm of fiction with that piece, or do I want to pull back and rewrite it as nonfiction? Going deeper, I'm aware of scaring myself in some of the things I've written. And it turns out, almost every time I've scared myself, I've written something that was of value. And for example, one poem I've had in the New Yorker was about taking care of my father when he had Alzheimer's. And it was about, the fact that you have to clean him up after he's soiled himself. And I've never read a poem about that before, about wiping your father's bum, And I sent it in a batch of poems to Paul Muldoon at the New Yorker, and I sent a bunch of poems that I thought were more sophisticated in a literary sense. But Paul immediately put his finger on that one and said, "That's the real one. I want that." And that taught me a lesson. I was scared to show that to other people. And when I'm scared, when I've written something that frightens me or makes me feel a little vulnerable, chances are I've got to pay attention to that. And I don't know if that's much of a help, but it's a start.
What's the name of the poem?
The poem in the New York, that's called Fathers and Sons. You can Google it, Fathers and Sons, it's right there. I'm really proud of it, it's a good poem. Okay, well, thank you all very much.
We are at the 7th Annual Terroir Creative Writing Festival, and Bob is one of the participants. Bob, tell us about yourself a little bit.
Well, I'm a person who likes to write. I like to write poetry and short stories, and I'm just really glad to be here. There's so many, wonderful sessions we're going to have, and
Is this your first year here, Bob?
no, I came the first couple of times they had it, when they had, Ursula K. Le Guin and Jean Hall, and
Down at the community center the first couple of years.
yeah. So, but I've been on a kind of hiatus, but this year seemed like a good year to pick it up again.
Great. So for someone who's never been here before, what would you say to them? If they say, I've heard about this, but I don't know whether or not I want to go. What would you say?
Well, it's always been fun, and you learn things, and also you get a chance to see the writing community that's in the area, because there's quite a large and vibrant community here. A lot of support for writers of all types.
Thank you, Bob.
Well, thank you.
We're at the 7th Annual Terroir Creative Writing Festival at the beautiful Chemeketa Community Campus here in McMinnville, Oregon. Hi, welcome to Terroir and to
Thank you.
Literally Literary. Would you like to tell us a little bit about your experience?
The festival was brought about by coming together of several people, and the primary person is Barbara Drake, and she's really been the driving force behind the festival for these 7 years. And a lot of work goes into it. We've had a number of outstanding authors, writers mostly from Oregon, and we're trying to give more voice to Yamhill County writers, because there's a tremendous amount of talent here in Yamhill County. We always have a challenge of raising enough funds, but we've managed to do do just fine, but for the future we'd like to find some additional funding. So anybody that wants to give a donation, that would be more than welcome. And it turns out to be a very inspiring day, I think, for everybody who comes. They can choose from a wide variety of fields, from poetry, fiction, nonfiction, how to publish your own work, many, many different areas. So there's something for everybody, and that's really one of its best features.
I noticed you have quite a diverse age range too. You're getting more and more
Yes.
young people here, aren't you?
That's excellent, and we do reach out to the schools to try and get them to send students. We have a scholarship program so that students can come without any financial hardship. And we don't get as many students as we'd like, but we've made real inroads, I think, into getting the word out, because we want to nourish young writers.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on Literally Literary. You have a lovely day.
Thank you.